I'm not sure if all of you were in the build session we did, where we created the Genway AI agent to do the research I'm going to talk about today. But the topic of the day, if I go back to this, is remote work, real talk. Basically, honestly, selfishly, I've been working remotely since COVID, and maybe you have as well. At first, it felt like it was something temporary. And then, at least for me, I moved from Silicon Valley all the way to South Florida, which is where I live today and where I'm broadcasting this from to you. And I've ever since worked at companies that are either remote first or completely remote. And these days, other than being a research partner to Genway, I'm also the head of UX research at Zapier. And Zapier is a completely remote company. We don't have any offices at all. Everyone works remotely. We get together once a year, and that's it. But 5 years-ish into this experiment of remote work, I think some questions come up. How has remote work affected our satisfaction with our jobs, our engagement with each other, our sense of belonging, our problem solving, our creativity, our at least perceptions of productivity, all sorts of other questions. And I wanted to explore those. So I leveraged the fact that I have access to Genway, and together with a bunch of people who joined the previous Genway Academy webinar, we built an AI agent, a Genway agent, to go and do that research for us. That Genway is an agentic AI platform that can go and do and run usability studies for you or contextual interviews, which is what this project was, contextual interviews. And in the future, probably a lot more, many more types of either unstructured or structured interviews. So I imagine, know that a lot more is coming. But this is what you can do with Genway, right? And you can plan, launch, execute, synthesize, and analyze the data all within the platform. So now we're going to talk about what came out of this research. And I call this remote work, real talk. 5 years in, how do people really feel about remote work? First of all, I always like to share some stats and like the research topic. So again, the research topic was all about understanding the impact of remote work on things like job satisfaction, engagement, team cohesion, creativity, and other tech worker sentiment. And in terms of statistics for this project, I ended up choosing to interview around 140 people, and then I stopped the project at that point. I was getting around 82% engagement, which means that 82% of those who started an interview finished it. If people interviewed for, say, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, but the interview was defined as a 15-minute or so interview, they don't count as fully engaged, even if they gave some responses. That's something you can play with in the system. The average conversation was about 11 minutes, which you can get a lot done in 11 minutes, so that makes sense to me. And 6% of the people interviewed chose to lengthen the interview and stick on for longer and talk to the AI agent for longer. Before we jump into the results, I'd love your participation. I'm curious if you could write down in the chat, what do you think, or how do you think remote work has impacted tech workers? What effects do you think we are about to see here on things like engagement, on things like satisfaction? Or do you have any idea of even just how you feel anecdotally about the impact of remote work if you work remotely? Would love to hear from you. So share your thoughts right before I share my insights and my thoughts on the topic. Very, very curious to see. Again, you can use the Zoom chat, Q&A, whatever works for you. I imagine you've used the chat before. Interesting. So I'm getting a question here. Interview quality metrics, as in sentiment or mood analysis. That's interesting. I've been talking to Genway and they've been developing an interview quality metric. So this is in the works. Don't really have that right now, but I'm curious what you mean by sentiment or mood analysis. Like, what was the interviewee's general sentiment throughout the interview or something else? And how does that connect with interview quality? Clarify some more, and maybe I can give some more information. We have another, Evan is saying, way more flexibility. So that's the positive of remote work, less sense of community, and more social isolation. Overall satisfaction, unsure. And I'm going to share some data even outside of the Genway research, but other research I did that I'm following up on with Genway interviews, which gives some interesting insights regarding what you just wrote. Let's dive in. I think one of my top thoughts is that remote work cons are mostly becoming weaker. So, yes, people are still talking about a slight sense of disconnection. They're talking about minor disconnection from colleagues, but that those feelings of disconnection have been moderated or weakened by access to Slack and other communication tools that people seem to feel are getting better than they used to be. So that's good to know. And yes, people do agree that there are some barriers to being a good partner to your cross-functional stakeholders when you don't get enough face-to-face interaction time, especially when it comes to specific goals. Like when you want to workshop something big, when you have a big goal for the year, people do agree that it can be helpful to have some face-to-face interaction time. But really, the biggest con related complaints that I heard was just about blurred boundaries, honestly, and the fact that work life and personal life all get mixed up for people who are working remotely. I love the fact personally that I have 3 doors in between my home office, which I'm in right now, and my home. But it's still 5 seconds to get in the house. And so there are some issues there in terms of boundaries. But when it comes to the pros, people are seeing a hell of a lot of pros when it comes to remote work, and they seem to be only getting stronger as opposed to the cons. Evan, to your point, like flexibility, work-life balance, job satisfaction. Basically, I don't have a perfect quantitative measure here, even though I conducted many interviews, but the general sentiment is that people feel more satisfaction, specifically because they have more control over their work environment and they can personalize their environment to what works for them. From a self-report perspective, people are claiming that they have boosted productivity by allowing focused work without interruptions. Now, I obviously don't have data on actual productivity, and I think there's a lot of questions on how you would even measure that in the first place. People are reporting higher productivity and all of these other metrics. We're already getting a sense of where things are going here, but there were some more specific insights that were interesting to me. So let's keep going here. People definitely miss in-person interaction for the social component of it. But with the rise of Slack, FigJam, Miro, communication and collaboration platforms have enabled the facilitation of core team interaction needs. So when I previously did research on this topic a while back, not using Genway just for my own curiosities, people were complaining a lot more that they don't have the tools necessary to do good core work and to interact easily with their teams. And that seems to be changing. People are finding it much easier to navigate remote communication, remote collaboration. They do miss the spontaneous, whatever you want to call it, water cooler meetings, like that sort of stuff. But that's really mostly on the social side of things. Whereas just 2, 3, 4 years ago, I was hearing a lot more on the professional side of things as well. And that's all but gone. Very interesting to me. Next up, I heard a ton in this study that being intentional about connection is what really matters. And that the more intentional connection is, the better the remote experience is too. So people who are finding remote work to work well for them feel like at the company they work at, they are having thoughtful, well prepared virtual meetings. They're still having team building activities, remote virtual team building activities, rather than just skipping that completely. And yes, they also have occasional in person gatherings to keep some of that in person magic going. But basically, the complaints about connection and about isolation were coming from people who felt like the companies they work for aren't intentional, aren't thoughtful about how they connect people. And maybe you feel this way too, where you get invited to a bunch of meetings, no one comes prepared to the meetings, there aren't any clear agendas, you're not even sure what you're doing there, you're not given enough time to read through the work async and comment on it. The meeting ends up being about something completely different from what was planned, etc., etc. That lack of intentionality is a major issue with remote work. Something very interesting I heard from a lot of people was that when it comes to the question of what yields great problem solving and creativity, I think most of us always talk about the in-office energy, right? There's like this crazy in-person energy that you can't get elsewhere. There's nothing like standing in front of a whiteboard with a bunch of your colleagues and solving a problem together. But what people who work remotely said is that they find that the fact that they're comfortable at home and the fact that they're focused at home really enhances their ability to be creative and to problem solve. And that in many cases, that matters more to them than being at a physical whiteboard with a bunch of other people sticking physical sticky notes onto the whiteboard or whatever it might be, which was very interesting to me. And that's why I titled the slide like comfort equals creativity. Maybe the fact that you're comfortable where you are, maybe the fact that you're in the perfect environment for you, maybe the fact that you are more focused is just as important, if not more important, as that hard to capture, hard to describe in-person energy. This was very interesting to me. Onboarding came up as the biggest issue with remote work. Like remote onboarding apparently sucks. People talk about how there's a lack of structured processes, especially in non-enterprise companies like SMBs, essentially, or companies smaller than 1,000 employees. There's a lack of automation, and that just prevents effective integration into a company. So a lot of complaints on that lack of structure, a lot of complaints on mediocre tooling that hinders knowledge sharing and collaboration, communication tools, whiteboarding tools, collaboration tools, actually some very strong feedback on those. But apparently, whatever tools companies are using for onboarding, not working as well. And so maybe this is a call out to anyone who might be watching this, who's working at a relevant company that works on onboarding for employees, like HR tools. And then mentorship programs. People do feel like it's harder to organize and run mentorship programs to guide and support new hires, which is interesting. So onboarding still sucks for remote. Some companies are remote first, but the onboarding is in person, and that can solve the problem, but maybe that's not ideal. Okay, so getting a question here about, or a follow-up question on the interview quality piece. Sentiment analysis, by that, Renu means mainly the emotional tone of the text. Is it positive, negative, or neutral? Or mood analysis, understanding the overall feeling or vibe. So two assessments of textual and emotional feedback. Can these metrics be used as thresholds to determine when a researcher needs to intervene? Just an idea. I love that. I think that part of what I'm hearing here is that if the vibe was really bad in a conversation, if the feedback was extremely negative, maybe that's a red flag that we need to follow up with a human researcher, or maybe it's a red flag that particular interview needs to be carefully revisited by a researcher rather than letting Genway incorporate that particular interview into its synthesis, just like any other interview. Maybe there are certain thresholds that you need to meet. I totally hear you. It is more challenging to accurately capture emotional tone and the general vibe of a conversation. Even humans aren't always that good at that, to say the least. But I would suggest that's coming. And I will also add that Genway is specifically working on better interview quality metrics such that it'll be much easier to exclude interviews from the analysis that don't meet a certain quality bar. So that's going to be coming as well. But a very interesting point. So thanks for sharing that, and keep the questions and the comments coming. Okay. So one interesting point I heard, which I wanted to quickly discuss, is that, I think the title here is wrong. So sorry about that. The title is wrong, but the subtitle is right. I don't know what the future of work is. I think that's still unclear, but it's clear what it isn't. In this research, there was a clear preference for remote or hybrid situations, especially for the autonomy and the flexibility of it. So it's like remote or mostly remote and a little bit hybrid to hybrid, but no one prefers to work in office. Like literally, I couldn't find a single person who said, I just love my 5 days a week in the office, sitting in traffic, whatever it might be. I just didn't see that in this. And maybe that's partially a function of the sample or other elements, but I'll, in just a couple of minutes, show you some additional data, which is probably less biased in terms of the sample, and the same thing comes out there. So I don't know if the future of work is hybrid or remote, or if it's 2 days a week hybrid, 3 days a week at home hybrid, whatever. I don't know. What I do know is that probably gone are the days of fully in office work, at least if it were up to the employees. Some companies are enforcing a full return to office, a full 5 day in office setup. I wish them the best of luck, but apparently that's very upsetting to the employees. So definitely an interesting point. But now I wanted to share with you that as I was running this research, I was also running some research on tech worker sentiment. This research was not for Genway, but I'm using Genway to follow up on the results of this survey that I conducted, which is a classic use case for AI. There are still good reasons to send out surveys to people. Surveys are still useful. But then you get the answers to those surveys and you end up with more questions than you started with. You want to follow up, but how do you follow up on, say, 10 questions, and you want to follow up on every one of those questions because you've got some very interesting results that you don't fully understand, and you want to talk to 5, 10, 20, 30 people about their answers because you want to get a really accurate picture of what's going on here. If you're a single researcher working on this project like I am, you're not going to do that, especially when, like me, you have a full-time job and other things you do, and you're a parent of 3 children, etc. So no way you can do that. Exactly. That's why we have triangulation. Surveys are tricky, and you can leverage Genway to triangulate on the results of your survey, which is what I'm doing right now. But let me show you these results because they're very interesting, and you're getting a sneak peek earlier than most of these results. So it's super exciting to see. I hope you enjoy it. One of the things I mentioned was career optimism. How optimistic or pessimistic are people about the future of their careers? Not their role, not the future of product management or the future of research or the future of marketing, but just in general about their careers. How optimistic are they feeling? And there was a statistically significant, but not really practically significant finding that fully in-office employees were a smudge more optimistic about their careers. Interesting. One thing that was very clear and was interesting, and it's an important confounding variable, is that younger people, age is an important confounding variable here. Younger people tend to work in office on average compared to mid-career or late career people, older people who are much more likely to be working remotely. And so maybe in this case, and again, it's a very small effect size, but maybe in this case, the optimism is more a function of age than a function of in office or not. But sometimes, just sometimes, the non-significant findings are even more interesting than the significant ones. I remember when I was in grad school, we always used to chase the statistically significant findings. And I always thought that was dumb because in some cases, first of all, statistical significance doesn't matter as much as practical significance, as in effect size metrics versus p-values. And second of all, sometimes it's fascinating to see what comes out non-significant, which might just be a function of age and not in office work. Everything else I measured, I saw no significant differences between remote work, hybrid work, and in-office work. Let's look at job enjoyment by work arrangement. No significant differences. People enjoy their work just as much, if not more, when working remotely than when they're in the office. Burnout. Are people getting more burnt out because they're working remote? No. If anything, they're getting a little more burnt out working in an office. These are the results. When we look at things like role clarity, do you have maybe less clarity about your role and what you should be doing because you're in this remote work context and you're less connected to the rest of your team or your manager? Nope. What about engagement? Are in-office employees more engaged with their work because they're in this high-energy, in-person environment and they're sticking sticky notes on physical whiteboards with their co-workers? Nope. They are not more engaged than fully remote or hybrid workers. No significant difference. What about, Evan mentioned earlier, what about social isolation, which the opposite of that, I would suggest, is a feeling of belonging. So what about belonging? We look at belonging, and again, there's no difference. And in fact, fully remote employees, at least in this sample, are even a smudge higher than, say, fully in-office employees. Interesting. But the bottom line here is that when it comes to any measure of sentiment, other than one, ain't really getting any differences between remote work and in-office work. So what's the bottom line of this stuff? I guess I have a few bottom lines that I'll share. And again, please share your questions, thoughts, comments in the chat. So here are a few bottom lines. Number one, the infrastructure for remote work is getting better and it's making a difference. People are saying, like, I have better tools these days to work remotely and it's making remote work better for me. Number two, people do not want to be in the office most days of the week. They just don't. It's very clear that if people got what they wanted, we would all be working either hybrid or remote, not fully in office. Number three, there will always be something magical, quote unquote, about in-person gatherings for relationship building. I don't think that's ever going to go away. I think that's a good thing. People like to meet in person, or most people like to meet in person. And I would absolutely recommend that any company, especially if it's a remote first company, should incorporate an in-person component throughout the year. Number four, the most relevant sentiment metrics I could think of when I was working on this research, there's no different, or they are no different for remote versus in office. None of them. Other than career optimism, which can be explained by age rather than in office or out of office, and it's a tiny effect size. We're just not seeing those things anymore. What does that tell you? And then Number five, there is still a question on de facto productivity. So, how much more or less productive are we when we work remotely? This type of research doesn't give a definitive answer to that. But I want to bring you back to point number one, which is the infrastructure for remote work is getting better and better. But you would expect that as the infrastructure for remote work gets better, so will our productivity. And if that's the case, then I'm not sure we need to be too concerned about productivity moving forwards. Those are my bottom lines. I'm curious about your opinions. I'm curious about your questions. So if you have any thoughts, questions, opinions on all of this, I would love to hear. I did look at gender, and there weren't any major differences across gender. There were small differences in that women were maybe a little less optimistic about their career and a little less satisfied in their job on average compared to men, which is to be expected given the experience of being a woman in tech can still be an unpleasant experience. That's unfortunate, and it's something we need to strive quickly to overcome. But they weren't large effects, and mostly speaking, there weren't any major gender related findings. What else? Anyone else? Evan saying great stuff. That's another important thing I'm curious about. Not sure if it was mentioned. Trust building in remote versus in person. I think it's super important for colleagues to build trust with each other. But I would speculate, also from personal experience, that this has been harder to do remotely. Distrust can lead to a lot of issues, as in inefficiencies, miscommunication, etc. I think it's a brilliant point. I can't say that I measured trust directly. In the Genway study, it definitely came up quite a bit. And maybe before we publish this, I will try and dive deeper into the elements of trust. So I'll definitely take that into consideration and work on that. I do agree that the downstream effects of mistrust can be problematic at the very least. So I love that comment. The survey data doesn't really include that directly. And the Genway data, the agent wasn't trained to focus on trust as a construct. But again, a lot of that stuff did come out in conversations. So I need to take another look at that theme. And I will. Thanks for that comment. Okay, another question. When sharing remote work findings with skeptical stakeholders, how can we account for social desirability bias, where workers might overstate productivity to support remote work? Honestly, yeah, I think that you, as a manager or as a leader or as a CEO of a company, you want the people working for you to feel like they're productive, to feel like they're focused, like they're energized. And if they do, that's probably good for you. But I think the bottom line probably matters to you more, which is, are they getting more stuff done? Now, this whole realm of productivity is completely changing right now because of AI. I was just talking to a peer at another company. He's a head of research at another company, and he was talking to his VP, and the VP was saying AI is getting really great at all sorts of execution related things, whereas humans are especially good at thinking, at strategy, at taking the execution that AI is taking on more and more of and making something of it. So, in this era we're in, where AI is taking on more and more execution roles, and it's impacting every single workflow within the entire research journey or whatever it is, product work, marketing work, productivity is starting to look a lot different. And expectations of employees are starting to look a lot different because we're expected to leverage AI agents and AI in general to be a lot more productive than ever before. Interesting times. And I think it's very important to come up with clear metrics for productivity and measure it from, to your point, a behavioral standpoint, not just people's perspectives. Thanks a bunch for that comment. Awesome comment. Anything else before we end today's get together? Because I don't have anything else outside of what I just shared. So let me know. Awesome. First of all, you're welcome for the perspective. And Evan, I'll take your question last. So Evan's asking, I'm really curious if there's any significant difference in participant behavior during an AI agent interview versus human-led. Do participants feel comfortable interviewing with an AI agent? Are they less forthcoming or more, or is there no difference? So first of all, it's tough to speak to the difference in behavior in an AI agent interview versus human led because none of these interviews were human led, right? So I don't know the counterfactual because I don't have the counterfactual. What I do know is that we always ask at the end of AI interviews, how was this experience for you? How was it interviewing with an AI? And because it's an AI, people tend to be very forthcoming because, like, I'm not going to offend an AI, so what do I care? I'm just going to say it as it is. Like, either it was fun or it was terrible, right? And I would say around 90% of people who interview with an AI share that it was a positive experience and that they enjoyed it. Even sometimes the feedback is a lot stronger than that. Like, it was very human-like. It was awesome, looking forward to doing this again, etc. So the overwhelming portion of feedback is positive when it comes to interviewing with AI agents. I suspect there are certain topics that people would prefer to talk to other people about, and that there are other topics that people would prefer to talk to an AI about rather than another person. What those topics are, we're still early in this AI interviewing era, so I'm not sure exactly what they are, but I can hypothesize some of those topics. So that's what I can tell you now. And the last thing I'll say about this is that on the one hand, there might be like a novelty effect where people like to interview with AI right now because it's new to them and they're just curious to see what it's like. But on the other hand, AI is only getting better over time. So even when the novelty wears off, I think the experience itself will be a lot better than it is currently. Like today, AI is the worst that it's ever going to be, and it's already pretty damn good. So even when the novelty wears off, I imagine that people will have a great experience. That's my honest take. There aren't answers to all of your questions, but certainly some of them. Make sense? Awesome. I'm really glad that you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for attending. I always mention that if you want to try this out for yourself, if you want to conduct AI interviews, all you have to do is go to genway.ai, open up an account, share the link with a few people, see what happens, and share your feedback with the Genway team or with me directly. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see how it works or doesn't work for you and what else you might want to know or what you might need. So let us know. Thanks a bunch for joining. I appreciate your time and have a great second half to the week. Bye for now, everyone. Cheers.